Chapter 1 Imperialism Part C Imperialism in Africa Part 1 The African continent was brought to the notice of the European nations for the first time when the Portuguese sailor Bartholomew Diaz accidentally reached the Cape of Good Hope during his voyage to discover India. While carrying out the slave trade, the Europeans got acquainted with the coastal regions of Africa, but the vast interiors of Africa remained unexplored till the middle of the 19th century. As the world did not know much about the African continent, it was called the Unknown or Dark Continent until the 18th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, some of the regions near the basins of the rivers Nile, Niger, Congo, and Zambezi were discovered and brought to the notice of the world by some courageous European travelers like Mungo Park, Captain Speke, Samuel Baker, David Livingstone, and Stanley. The travelogues through the Dark Continent and Darkest Africa, written by Stanley, an American journalist, created a curiosity among the Europeans. Thereafter, a competition for capturing the best regions of Africa arose among the European nations, and the continent became a prey to imperialism. The division of Africa and imperial expansion. The imperial expansion in the African continent by the European nations is one of the most significant events in the history of the world. Belgium was the first European nation to establish its colony in Africa. In the second half of the 19th century, King Leopold of Belgium set up a colony in the Congo River Basin. By 1870, colonies were set up in the coastal regions of Cape, Natal, Lagos, Gold Coast, and Gambia by England. Algeria, French Guinea, and Ivory Coast were colonized by France, and Mozambique and Angola were under the Portuguese control. The Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference was held at Berlin between 1884 and 1885 by the European nations in order to decide how the African territories would be split up among them without going to war for it. The nations agreed to a principle of effective possession. It passed a set of directives for the division of the African regions. Based on these directives, the African regions were distributed among the European nations interactively by the year 1914. England. In addition to its colonies set up in the Niger River Basin of Africa, England dominated Cape Colony, Sudan, Uganda, Rhodesia, East Africa, Gambia, Nigeria, etc. Under the pretext of security of the Suez Canal, England took possession of Egypt too. Holland. The Dutch set up its colonies in Cape Colony, Natal, Orange Free State and Transvaal. France. The French moved up the Senegal Basin and captured the Sahara Desert, Algeria, French Congo, Madagascar Island and Morocco. Germany. Germany set up its colonies in Southwest Africa, Cameroon and the East African regions. Spain. Spain colonized the Rio de Oro region, north of Morocco, and some areas in Guinea coast. Portugal. The Portuguese set up colonies in the eastern regions, Angola region and Mozambique. Italy. Italy dominated Eritrea, Somaliland and Tripoli in Africa. Thus, the entire continent of Africa, barring Ethiopia and Liberia, was colonized by the European nations. Chapter 1. Imperialism. Part C. Imperialism in Africa. Part 2. The effects of imperialism. The European nations forced supremacy over the Asian and African colonies and exploited them in various ways and grew richer. The imperial tendency of dominating the regions of the weaker nations had both constructive and destructive effects on the entire world. The constructive effects of imperialism. The constructive effects of imperialism on the lives and welfare of the colonized people were: 1. Physical reformations. The colonizers carried out physical reformations for their own benefit, such as building of roads and canals for quick military movement and internal transportation. They introduced railways, post, telegraph, aeroplanes, etc. These reformations benefited the locals too and helped in interaction among the people. Thus, imperialism brought in new technologies and improved transportation. 2. Spread of education. Instead of importing qualified people from Europe, the colonizers began to educate the local people for raising qualified manpower necessary in assisting administration. This was a blessing in disguise for the locals, as they came under the impact of Western education. 3. Intellectual change. With the boost in Western education, there began and intellectual exchange among the people from different parts of the world. People learnt about the innovative ideas, technology, science, philosophy, literature, law, and politics. They were introduced to the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Philosophies of nationalism, socialism, communism, and democracy were also introduced to them. The colonized nations produced many social and religious reformers who helped uproot social evils like ignorance and blind faith. Thus, a progressive mindset was created and a positive intellectual change was brought in due to imperialism. The destructive effects of imperialism. 1. Trade of slaves. The imperial nations considered themselves to be superior to the people of the colonies and thus ill-treated them. They carried on the practice of slavery for getting laborers at a cheap rate. This ghastly act was uncalled for. 2. Decline of values. The imperial nations adopted the policy of divide and rule to maintain their reign. They sowed a sense of enmity among the social groups. Thus, violence, selfishness, and indulgence cropped up among the people. As a result, degradation of morality was witnessed in the colonies. 3. Economic exploitation. Economic exploitation of the colonies began with the setting up of the colonies. The countries of Asia and Africa were rich in raw materials. The imperial nations needed raw materials for their industries. The reason for colonialism was the immediate financial gain from the extraction of raw materials by means of enslaved native people. 4. Destruction of village autonomy. According to the land revenue system adopted by the British government, the farmers had to mortgage their land. The farmers started to give land instead of money as tax to the British government. As a result, they became bankrupt. Thus, the villages lost their self-reliance. 5. Suppression of underdeveloped nations. The imperial nations exploited both the economics and cultures of the people of the colonies. They governed the people in the colonies thoughtlessly, putting many nations into the shackles of dependence. Later, the suppressed nations had to undertake a long-drawn struggle for freedom. 6. Armament race. The cutthroat rivalry among the European nations for imperial expansion made the nations brace up their military to ensure security. This led to the arms race, as the imperial nations grew suspicious of one another. The desire for ruling other nations gave rise to small-scale struggles. These struggles gradually grew into intense conflicts, resulting in the First World War that broke out in the year 1914.